Well, good evening, everybody. Selamat malam. As I've recently been to Indonesia, about 4 or 5 months ago, giving a presentation at the conference hosted by Pak Agus here. So one thing I promised him at dinner tonight, that I would not use the same slides that I used in his presentation, which I know some of you attended. So I'm going to keep to my promise. But I've been asked to speak about some of the key developments that I see in the East Asian region from a geopolitical point of view, and just sketch out for you some of the implications that I see. I'm only going to speak for 15 minutes, maybe 20 at the most, because we would like to leave some time for questions and answers. So please bear with me if I go through this a little quickly, but the main idea is to get you thinking about some of the issues. So I guess the first point I want to make to you tonight is that all of us here have lived through a very peaceful era in East Asian affairs. For 38 years we have not seen a major conflict in this part of the world. If you think back to those of you who remember this period, 1979 was the last time that we had a significant military conflict in this part of the world, which is when China intervened in Vietnam to teach the Vietnamese a lesson for their intervention in Cambodia. So that was 1979, 38 years ago. And a lot of us thought that this was the future, that the peaceful era that we've lived through for the last 38 years was the new normal for this part of the world. A very significant and important change, given how much conflict we have seen in Asia over really hundreds of years. Well, I'm afraid the bad news that I convey tonight is that what I call the long peace in Asia is over, and that we are beginning to return to what I consider to be a more normal period in Asian history, which is a region that is beset by great power rivalry once again, and a lot of other tensions that are not necessarily going to lead us to war. Let us hope that's not the case. But certainly the risk of conflict and interstate rivalry and transnational challenges to security is rising quite significantly. And I want to just put up this map, which is a little bit difficult for you to see, I think probably from the back table, but if I can just make a few broad points. So this slide just encapsulates some of the many challenges that we're confronting. So if you think about the maritime domain, and if you work your way down from north to south, from the Kuril Islands through the East China Sea to the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean, we are starting to see a lot of conflict in the maritime domain. I know that we spend a lot of time talking about the South China Sea, but it's not just the South China Sea. It's the whole Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean too. We're seeing a build-up in tensions between major powers. We haven't seen that for a long time. But in addition to that, we still have some hangovers from the old Cold War, the Korean Peninsula. Taiwan is still an issue that has not been resolved. And we have, of course, a raft of transnational issues that have been around for quite some time. Piracy, the movement of people, unregulated movement of people, and the most recent example of that are the Rohingya refugees coming out of Myanmar. So, and I've also put up a couple of other pictures here. The one to the right is the Doklam Plateau I'm going to talk about, and the tensions between India and China. And further south in the Philippines, as you know, the major problem we've had there with Islamic State-oriented insurgent groups, jihadist groups, that are challenging the writ of the central government in the Philippines, in Marawi in particular. So there's just really a quick summation of some of the many challenges that we confront. A lot of these are quite recent. In fact, when I was up here in May, I wasn't talking about Marawi because it hadn't really happened. Nor was I talking about the Doklam Plateau, nor was I really talking about the Rohingya asylum seeker issue, although it has been around for a couple of years. So you can see even in the 6 months since I was last here, there have been significant deterioration in our geopolitical environment. Okay, so North Korea, an old problem, but it's gone to the top of the security agenda in this region for a couple of reasons. I've summarised them there in this slide. So basically what has happened is Kim Jong-un, who's been in power now for 6 years, has accelerated the nuclear weapons programs developed by his father and his grandfather to the point where it's now become the major security challenge we're confronting in this part of the world. There's clearly a nuclear dimension to it, and this slide summarises it. So Kim Jong-un has succeeded in a very rapid period of time in developing an intercontinental ballistic missile potentially capable of targeting the mainland United States and Australia for that matter, because we worry about this too. Now that's a quite important change. So he's developed the nuclear weapons, he's got the missile systems to put them on. There are still some technical problems to overcome, but we're talking about a significant nuclear power on our doorstep that has developed nuclear weapons in contravention of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is the problem we're confronting, and it could actually get worse because Mr. Kim has declared his intention to develop a hydrogen bomb. So the sorts of nuclear weapons we're talking about and worrying about up to now have been relatively small yield nuclear devices of the kind that we used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Still very destructive, still capable of destroying a large part of a city and killing lots of people. But a hydrogen bomb is a much more serious development because it has perhaps 100 times the power of the sorts of nuclear weapons I've just been talking about. And Mr. Kim has threatened to carry out a test of a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean, in our neighbourhood. So that's something to worry about. And the other thing, for those of you, most of you who have military backgrounds will understand that it's not just nuclear weapons that can be developed from land-based systems, but Kim is developing a submarine-launched ballistic missile capability. Still very basic, very rudimentary, but that's what he's trying to develop. So this is quite a formidable capability, and my own assessment is that he will have a nuclear weapon that he can mount on an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, that's going to reach the United States, the mainland United States, including as far as New York by 2020. That's not very far away. Okay, and just to show you how much he's accelerated this nuclear program, you can see here that since he came to power in about 6 years ago, there's been an enormous acceleration in the number of missile tests that he's done. And I could show you another slide which also shows a relevant increase in the nuclear testing as well. Right, sorry. Okay, and just to get a little bit technical for a moment. So the North Koreans initially argued that they were developing rockets for civilian purposes, to launch satellites, telecommunication satellites. This rocket here is called the Hwasong rocket. Allegedly launched a satellite some years ago. But of course, it's pretty clear now that this was not for civilian purposes, it's clearly for military purposes, because this is the basis of the new ICBM that Mr. Kim is developing. It's basically this Hwasong rocket, but with improvements. So you can see that he's used his civilian program to develop a military capability. And that just gives you some idea of the ranges. So the key takeaways here are that already he has a demonstrated capability to target most of Asia, including Indonesia and parts of northern Australia. We know that for a fact. That shows that his missiles can't quite reach the mainland United States, but it's pretty clear that he's only a couple of years away from increasing the range very substantially from 6,500 kilometres to probably 10,000, 11,000 kilometres, which gives him almost a global reach. Okay, and one final thing I want to make about North Korea, it's not just the nuclear issue. Because if you think about a confrontation between North Korea and the United States, it could actually result in a rerun of the Korean War, a conventional conflict on the Korean Peninsula that could gravitate towards a nuclear strike. So it could start off as a conventional war, once again. It's not just the question of nuclear missiles. So let's not forget that North Korea has quite formidable armed forces. Its special forces, for example, are roughly about 88,000 strong. That's just its special forces. They are very well equipped and very well trained. So if there is to be a conflict in Northeast Asia, it could well be a combination of conventional warfare of the kind we saw during the Korean War, plus the real possibility of it escalating to a nuclear crisis if we were not able to put a cap on this. That's the real worry with North Korea. Now, I just want to talk about the South China Sea. I know a lot of you have talked about this at some length. I just want to summarise, make a couple of key points about the South China Sea. So the South China Sea has really only become a big geopolitical issue really since about 2012. And the reason it's become one is that these disputed islands, and there have been ongoing tensions in the South China Sea now for many, many years, not just involving China. But what the game changer is that China has now started to assert itself in the South China Sea. It started to claim islands and small coral reefs that were previously disputed. And as you know already, the Chinese have taken the opportunity to occupy a number of these disputed islands and militarise them, right? And I'll show you some slides in a minute. So this wouldn't perhaps matter if the South China Sea wasn't so important, but it is now the most important sea in the world. And why is that? Because it reflects the generation-long switch of power or change in power from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It's the coming of age of the Asian economies, the gravitation of economic and financial power to Asia, and that's been reflected in enormously rapid increase in shipping that goes through the South China Sea. So it's important for all of us for oil, energy, and for just all the commodities that countries need to exist off, and China in particular is very dependent on this trade. So you can understand why China is concerned about the security of the sea lines of communication. Unfortunately though, China has decided to unilaterally occupy these islands and militarise them in a way that I don't think is compatible with the sort of stability that I personally would like to see in this part of the world. So it is a game changer. And just to refresh you, when people talk about the South China Sea, they focus on that part of it, but it's really through the whole Western Pacific. And even the South China Sea, you have three distinct groups: the Paracel Islands, the Spratly Island group, and over here the Scarborough group, close to the Philippines. And China has essentially occupied most of the Paracels, a significant number of the Spratly Islands, and it clearly has designs on the Scarborough Reef. So just to illustrate, one island, the Fiery Cross Reef, which some of you are familiar with, let's just have a quick look at what China has done. So these are satellite imagery from earlier this year, and you can see that there is no question that these islands have been built for military purposes. These are not way stations to help fishing vessels. It's not about navigation. It's not about that. You don't build a 3,000-metre runway to take military aircraft with reinforced concrete hangars, point defence, radar installations, radomes, etc. For civilian purposes. So I think that's one indication, and if you just have a look at close-up there, you'll see clearly the radomes here on Fiery Cross Reef, which are clearly only for military purposes. So I think, you know, the evidence is now in, after 2 or 3 years of watching what China has been doing, that these are essentially military garrisons. And what does that mean? Well, if you look at that, you can see that China now has the capacity to provide surveillance cover, intelligence cover, air defence virtually over the whole of the South China Sea. It did not have this capability before. This has all happened in basically 5 years. So nothing can move through the South China Sea without China knowing about it, and it now has the capacity to intercept and control in a way that it didn't before. So that's I think, a concern for many countries about where this goes. And the final point about this is this the end or is this the beginning? So if you just to give you one example, in the Natuna Islands, China does now apparently has launched a formal claim to part of the Natuna EEZ, I'm told. That's now public. So Indonesia, in my opinion, is no longer able to present itself as an honest broker on the South China Sea because the Chinese clearly believe they have a territorial dispute with you in the EEZ of the Natuna. That's the way I see it. Okay, now, we don't talk about Senkaku Islands much, but I just want to make one point about this. This is also a very critical issue in the East China Sea because it involves China and Japan in a dispute over the ownership of this island. And of course, as you know, it's not just the island itself, but if you can successfully claim ownership of an island, you can claim a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, and that could be a game changer in the East China Sea. And the pattern, the Chinese actions in the East China Sea are very similar to those in the South China Sea. And if you just look at this graph here, the takeaways here, so these are charts showing the number of incursions by Chinese vessels into the territorial sea and the contiguous zone of the Senkaku Islands. And if you look here, you can see 2012, virtually none. From 2012, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of Chinese vessels penetrating the territorial sea and the contiguous zone. The red lines show the incursions in the territorial sea, and the blue, the contiguous zone. So clearly this has not happened by chance. This is clearly a policy decision in Beijing. It's part of a strategy, and the reality is that even though the islands are disputed, Japan has been the administrator of these islands since the Second World War. So the Japanese clearly see this as an infringement on at least on their administration of the islands, and a provocative move. So we have problems like this all the way through the Western Pacific. I'll just to remind you of them. Okay, very quickly, those of you who are not aware of where the Doklam Plateau is, just to give you a bit of context, you know that India and China fought a border war in 1962. And there have been ongoing tensions on their border since. In the 62 war, where the Chinese essentially defeated the Indians, the Chinese took Aksai Chin and the Indians Arunachal Pradesh. But some of these little areas here are still disputed. Now this one is where the tension has built up in the last 4 months. It's been temporarily resolved, but basically the People's Liberation Army have been building a road system right through that part of China and pushing up into Bhutan, which is obviously a neutral state, if you like, although heavily influenced by India. And the Indians felt that they had to support Bhutan in pushing back the Chinese road system, and there was a confrontation between the Indian army, Chinese army over this. And fortunately, tensions have calmed down a bit, but this is an ongoing problem, and it's symptomatic of broader strategic tensions that are growing between India and China, and could result, in my opinion, in future border clashes and a rivalry between India and China over the foreseeable future on land and in the sea as well. So that is something to watch. It's not just about China versus the US or China versus Japan, but China's got problems with India as well. Okay, and 2 final points before I finish. I think we should just very quickly talk about, or raise or pose the question, is there a possibility of an ISIL or a Daesh caliphate in the Philippines? My bottom line is I don't think so, but the risk has increased that something like that could occur if the countries of the region do not take consolidated efforts to push back. And if you recall what happened, this really surprised and shocked just about everybody. So we saw the Philippines Armed Forces go into Marawi City, chasing the Abu Sayyaf group, which has been operating there for many years, and suddenly they found themselves in almost a major conventional battle with 500 heavily armed jihadis, many of whom were from overseas, not from the Philippines. And as you know, 5 months, nearly 6 months later, they have only just managed to clear the city. This is a city of nearly 250,000 people, which has been largely destroyed, unfortunately, as a result of the conflict. So this was a shock to everybody. No one expected this. And of course, it raises all sorts of questions. Where did the arms come from? Where did the money come from to support these groups, the Maute group, Abu Sayyaf? Suddenly, where do these foreign fighters come from? Does this mean that there are going to be other parts of the Philippines that are also going to be targeted by these new jihadi groups? And the evidence from documents captured suggests that that is their intention. They were going to seize Marawi. They thought they could occupy and take it in about a week, and then they were going to target adjacent cities and build up what they hoped would be the beginning of a new Southeast Asian caliphate, drawing on their experiences from Iraq and Syria. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I just pose the question to you to think about. Is it possible that there could be another Marawi in the Philippines that could draw in like-minded radicals from other parts of the region, both Muslims and non-Muslims? Because in my own country, Daesh have been very successful in recruiting non-Muslims into their cause. So this is not just a kind of an issue. It's not about Islamic movements. It's basically terrorist groups that have quite compelling capabilities to recruit people from all walks of life and from every country. That's the problem that's posed. So that's a question for us to think about, and that's just an example of the four groups that have declared for Daesh. I'll use the term Daesh, right? We haven't seen this in the Philippines before until very recently, so this is a new development. And finally, I just want to talk very quickly about the Rohingya problem as indicative of a new range of transnational challenges to this region, which are not necessarily about insurgencies or military conflict between states or geopolitical rivalry. This is a different kind of security challenge, but no less complex, no less difficult to overcome. So here we have a situation where one ethnic group essentially is attacking another group. So the Burmese majority basically see the Rohingya as Bangladeshis, foreigners from Bangladesh, although strictly speaking that's not true. Many of these people, the Rohingya, have been living in Burma or Myanmar for many, many decades, and they're first and second and third generation. But the Buddhist majority Myanmar, or Burma, whichever term you want to use for the country, they see this as a threat from foreigners who are not of their religion, and the government's aim is clearly to get them out of the country and back into Bangladesh. And already 600,000 of the 1.2 million Rohingya have been forced back across the border into Bangladesh, and as you also know, onto boats in the sea, as you've experienced a couple of years ago, coming down to Malaysia and Indonesia. So this is a complicated problem, and it's an intra-ASEAN problem. It's a difficult one for Indonesia to come to grips with, because Myanmar is obviously an ASEAN member state, but also these Rohingyas are seeking asylum, including in Indonesia. How do you deal with this? So, okay, so I'll just finish up by summarising. So, key points. Unfortunately, I think our long piece is over. We are going to face geopolitical challenges from a rising China, but also increasing tension and rivalry between other major states in the region. There's going to be pushback from countries that feel threatened or feel that the China challenge is something that's quite fundamental to their independence and their sovereignty. So we're going to have pushback, and it's not hard to see some miscalculation or incident causing a broader conflict in the region between major states. And then we've got the possibility of an increased likelihood of irregular conflicts of the kind I've just talked about in Marawi, increases in terrorism, and of course transnational problems of the kind I've just mentioned in Myanmar. So I don't want to depress you over dinner, but it is my business to talk about these things. So there are a lot of things to think about, and all of these issues will require, in my view, a lot of collaboration and cooperation by countries in the region to sign on to shared approaches to push back against some of these challenges. And that's going to be the hard bit, is to getting international cooperation to identify what these challenges and sketch out a strategy for managing the many challenges that we confront. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your time. We'll take some questions later on. Thank you.